Okay, so this is the second video here in this sort of Provus tutorial. In this video, I'm going to be showing just how you go from essentially a plate to a ribbon in Provus and how you can manipulate these conductors within Provus, within the viewport, among other things. So, to start, I'm going to start with the assumption that we have no pre-existing conductors in our project. However, uh, it might be, and probably is the case, that you might be starting from some pre-existing Maxwell plates, which would be good. And so to bring those in, what you would do is go to the File drop-down menu and you'd click Load Maxwell Plates. And then you would just navigate to wherever your .pte files are and select them for import, and those will be brought in no problem. But I'm going to work under the assumption that we are starting from nothing here. So I'm going to show you how you would create a plate to start with. So we're going to go navigate in our viewport, and to create a plate, we're going to hold Control, and while holding Control, we're going to right click, and then we're going to select the option that says Create Plate here. So you're going to be prompted to give it a name, so I'm just going to call it Plate 1. Okay, and so now our plate has been generated, and we can see it in the viewport. So now we're going to talk about how we actually go about, controlling plates in Provus, essentially. So first thing to note about plates, or really any object in Provus, is you're going to want to control and left click. And by doing that, you're going to select an aspect of the plate. So if I click in the center of the plate here, the plate's selected. And if I hit, you can tell it's selected because it's highlighted in yellow. And if I hit enter, I'm going to be met with this dialog window for a plate. And so you can see we have all kinds of parameters in here, some that might look familiar and some that probably won't. But so if we start at the top here, we can see sort of the typical things like XYZ, strike length and depth extent, and then we have dip direction, dip, and plunge, and our conductance. So those should all be familiar for a plate conductor. So how do we go about changing some of these variables? So I'm going to show you how you would do it just using the viewport. So as I mentioned, holding Control and left clicking is going to be a very common thing that you do in Provus, because that's how you select and highlight stuff in the viewport. So for starters, if I just hold Control and left click, I have selected this vertex here of the plate. And so now, actually I should mention before I get started here, navigating in the viewport, if you hold down left click and drag your mouse, you'll sort of rotate your view here. If you scroll in or out, you will zoom in or out. And if you hold down your scroll wheel and move your mouse around, you will sort of translate your view here, which can be very useful as well. So as I'm sort of whipping around the viewport here, that's what I'm doing to move around. But yeah, so if I have this vertex selected here and I hold right click, I can drag. And so now I'm changing the plunge of the plate here, and you can actually see it changing in the text window here next to plunge. So you can see I'm changing the plunge. And so another way to do that would be to go over into the dialog window if you have it open, and you can just use your scroll wheel. And if you scroll up and down, you can see this is another way that you can go and change these plate parameters. And so this, of course, will work for the other parameters as well. So if I want to change the dip, I could do so in the dialog window by scrolling up and down in this text box here next to dip. You can see we're changing the dip there. Or another way to do it would be to highlight the plate using Control left click. I'm just going to maximize this here. And you can see actually at the bottom of the viewport, we have a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, which will be very useful, which actually tell you which keys can change which parameters. So if I have my plate selected, which I do, and I press W, I can change the dip. And if I press D, I can reverse that change, right? And so looking at the bottom there, if I press A, I can change the strike or the dip direction in this case, because horizontal. So So those are basically the two ways that you can change those plate parameters in the viewport. So I've talked about most of these, but what about the U and the V? So you'll notice our plate here has this pyramid in the center, and this is the center of rotation for the plate. And so why this might be useful is you're able to essentially, if you highlight this pyramid by control left click, you can go ahead and if you hold Z and you left click this center of rotation here, if you left click, you're able to move it such that I've now put the center of rotation in whole. And I'll show you why that's useful in a second. So this U and V coordinate corresponds to the location of this center of rotation. And you can see right now the pyramid here is in the center of the plate, and the UV coordinates are 0.5 and 0.5. And the reason that is because these coordinates basically span from 0 to 1 in both dimensions. So if it's 0.5, 0.5, then it's going to be in the center. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to hold right click, and I'm going to drag the plate so that it's no longer in the center of the rotation there. And so you can see what happened to the V coordinate here. Since I've gone off the plate, it's now in the negatives. But so the reason for me doing this is because this is sort of representative of a case that you might commonly run into when you're plate modeling borehole data. So first thing, which I didn't mention here, if you highlight these arrows using control left click and hold right click to drag, you could change the dimensions of the plate from the viewport. So, but the reason why I put this center of rotation in the hole is that now I'm able to rotate my plate relative to the hole. And so I can do the same thing for the dip, right? So this is all very useful for when you're trying to fit a plate to some downhole data, being able to sort of rotate it about some given point in the hole. And so that is a really, really important feature. And then finally, in terms of moving around plates, there's one thing I didn't mention, which is if you have your plate selected, and this is true for more than just plates in Provus, but if you hold T while the plate is highlighted yellow here, and you hold down the right click on your mouse button, you can translate the entire plate, which is very important as well. Okay, so that should cover a lot of sort of moving and manipulating plates in Provus. So let's go back to our dialog here. And so we've gone over most of these. These checkboxes here are the ability to paint on different functions like eddy currents and the primary field. So I'll revisit those once we've run a simulation with our conductor. Right here, this slider gives you the ability to change the transparency of your plate, which can be very useful. So you can see right here, changing your transparency, change the color of your plate, so you can differentiate between conductors. And then these values here are essentially the amount, how much the dip or the dip direction will increase or decrease with each iteration. So if you need more granularity, you can decrease those or increase them to fit your needs there. Okay, and then another very important thing here is this undo button in the very bottom left. So if you've made some adjustments to your plate and you realize you've made an awful mistake, you can click this undo button and that will revert your change, whatever change you just made in order. And so you can keep clicking that until you get back to where you were. Okay, so let's assume that you've gotten to a point with your plate where you are relatively satisfied with the fit, and now you want to promote it to a ribbon and see if you can improve any more on that fit. So the way to do that would be to have your open up your object dialog, and you want to click promote to surface, and you're going to be prompted to give it a name. I'm going to call it ribbon 1. Okay, and so now we are done with our plate, so I don't need to see that anymore. So I'm going to go over to the world tree on the left here, and I am going to uncheck plate 1. And so now we are met with our ribbon. And so the first thing you'll note is there's seems to be two sort of rectangles here. And so the purple is our ribbon conductor, and this red rectangle is the canvas which our ribbon conductor sort of lives on. And so this is going to be really important to sort of understand how these two play together. So firstly, you should note that this ribbon is mainly controlled by these two control lines on either side. So let me just make this more ribbon-like. So similar to plates, we are able to obviously control things like we can highlight it and hold T, and if we right click, we can drag it relative to the canvas. And you'll note that our ribbon is now largely controlled by these control lines, which you see in orange here. And so I can highlight one and right click and drag. And so that will be changing this dimension of the ribbon here. So I now have highlighted this control point on the control line of the ribbon. And so if I want to add more points to have to be able to control it more, I can click plus or minus depending on which side of the ribbon you're at. But you can see this just created a new control point. And so that will give me the ability by selecting it and holding right click, I can now drag to manipulate this ribbon surface in any way I choose. And you can do the same thing on the other side. So I selected that and then pressed the plus button on my keyboard, which gave me this this extra control point. And so I can do that again, which will make another one. And so these can be used, the more control points you have, sort of the more complicated you can make your ribbon conductor here. Okay, so that's all fine and good. What if I accidentally added more control points than what I need or what I want? You can highlight them and then press delete, and that will get rid of any unneeded control points on these control lines. So I haven't really talked about the canvas. So the canvas is what actually lets us sort of contort this ribbon conductor into all kinds of different shapes. So the canvas control lines are outlined here in pink, and the control points are at the ends of these control lines. And so I can highlight a control point of the canvas and I can drag it, right? And you can see it's bringing down this bottom left corner, and you can see how that's affecting our ribbon conductor, which lies in this canvas, right? And so obviously you can do that for any point on a control line. Or you can highlight the control line itself if you want to move both sides in tandem, right? And you can manipulate the canvas this way. So what you can now do, so if I wanted to manipulate the center of my canvas so that there's like a bump or an anticline in it, I couldn't do that the way it's currently constructed because I don't have a control line going through the center of my canvas here, which is currently highlighted in yellow, right? So what you do is you make sure your canvas is selected by control and left click, and then you can hold down the Z button on your keyboard, and you can left click somewhere in the center here of your canvas, and that will create an extra control line. So you can see now we have a control line going through the center of our canvas here. And so now if I wanted to create sort of like a hump or like an anticline, I can do that. So I can raise that control line up. I can bring the corners down. And now I have this sort of hump, anticline, parabola type thing. And so now I want to reorient my ribbon conductor so it's more centered and in line with this control line. So one thing you can do, which I haven't mentioned yet, is you can highlight your ribbon and you can press G and that will rotate it, or you can press Shift G and that will rotate it in the opposite direction. And so this red dot, which is your rotation point, is what your ribbon will be rotated about. And you can always translate this by selecting it and holding T and right click dragging. So that's an important thing to note. So yeah, you want to rotate that using G or Shift G, and then I'm gonna drag my control points to make it a little more elongated, like this. And then I'm gonna select my ribbon control lines, and I'm gonna drag down on each side. So now my conductor is sort of this folded hinge-like ribbon. So now let's say that I wanted to add like a depression in the middle, right? Or if I wanted to add some more structure, I wanted to deform it in the middle here. Well, I couldn't do that currently because the only options I have are to move this control line or to move these control points. But similar to the ribbon, I can add more control points by selecting and either pressing plus or minus depending on which side of the canvas you're on. So if I do that, you can see I went ahead and added another control point in the center. And so now if I wanted to make like a depression here in the middle, right? And maybe I bring these edges up. So now we have this kind of saddle-like conductor or saddle-like ribbon. And another thing to note, just like we did with the ribbon conductor where we shifted it about this red dot using G or Shift G, we can do the same thing with this surface by pressing G or Shift G. And equally, the way that we translated this ribbon by selecting it and holding T and then right clicking and dragging, we can do the same thing with our canvas by holding T and holding right click and dragging it. So if I wanted to move this conductor so that it's actually intersecting a hole here, I could do that. Okay, so now we're intersecting a hole. And so before I go run a simulation here, a couple more things. One, oftentimes you won't have a need to have this surface visible in the viewport. So if you select the ribbon conductor and press Alt, you can see now this surface has disappeared from the viewport, but I can still, drag my ribbon vertices and everything. The ribbon's still functional and you can still move it. It's just sometimes you don't need to see that canvas. So you're able to hide it using left Alt. Another thing, if you open the ribbon dialog by highlighting it and pressing enter, you'll see that it's similar to our plate dialog, but there's some additional options. And so one of those options at the bottom here, so you can also toggle your canvas from here. Some of these options here, so we have the ability to change the size of the control points. So if you need to make them bigger, that's like ludicrously big, but you can increase them or decrease the size of them as needed. Sometimes they can be kind of hard to see if you've got a lot going on in your project, so this can be useful. And the ribbon vertex drag sensitivity, so this value is also very useful. So if you're trying to make really fine-tuned adjustments, but when you're holding right click and moving your mouse, it's just moving too much and you can't really get it where it needs to be, you can go and change this value to decrease it or increase it to whatever is appropriate for what you're doing, which is also important. So under here we have the lock and prevent changes. So if you're really happy with what you have and you don't want to accidentally change anything, you can click this checkbox and that will make it so that it can't be changed. And at the bottom here, just as it was very important for the plates, it's equally or more important for ribbons. You have the ability to go through and undo any changes that you made. So you can see if I clicked it there and it started moving it back to previous states. So that's a very, very important feature that you're probably going to be using a decent amount. And then also you have the ability to change your the color of your canvas here and the transparency as well, which is very useful as well. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to run a simulation with this ribbon conductor that we just created. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over to the simulation tab. Okay. And we're going to run a new simulation. And we're going to do it for this hole right here, which I've selected using Control left click. And so actually before I run the simulation, I'll just bring up the data profile dialog. So like every object in Provus, if you highlight it and click enter, you'll be given access to the dialog window. And so for data profiles, you have the ability to change the color of the borehole or the data profile. You can change the thickness that it's drawn in the viewport. The reference point you can toggle on or off, and that was shown in the previous video where if you right click on a plot, it'll put a marker at the corresponding depth downhole, which is nice. And then this is important. So you can draw the component orientation. So you can see you have your X, Y, and Z components drawn out for you here, so you can have a better sense of what's going on with the fields. And so that's a very useful tool as well. And so I'm just going to go through and run a simulation now. So I'm going to call this 231208 max. And I'm going to select the corresponding hole here, 231208 max. Okay, and then I'm going to select our saddle ribbon-like conductor from the project conductors container. And I'm going to activate our simulation, and I'm going to run. And so now I just have to plot that up so we can take a look. 231208 max. Okay, so this is the response from our saddle there, and it obviously doesn't fit very well because it was never meant to fit very well, but you can see it's been automatically updated and shows the predicted data in green. And you can see if I right click anywhere on the plot, you can see this orange disk that is representing the depth that I'm clicking on here, right clicking. So that can be, you can see it's intersecting right here, and that's where the disk goes. So that's very useful. But now that we've run a simulation, we can go back to our ribbon conductor, and if we press enter, bring up the object dialog again. And now we can get into these variables that I sort of skipped over. So if I click this checkbox here, it will paint the basis functions on our ribbon conductor, which can be very useful. It can also paint the eddy currents. So our data here is UTEM, so channel 1's the latest here. So we can go to the earliest time here and see what the eddy currents are doing and watch it sort of disperse. We can paint the eigenfunctions, the primary field, and then the percent field leakage, which is like a sort of like a QA/QC tool. The idea being that there should be very low leakage around the center of your conductor. So it's another sort of QA/QC check that you can do. And so finally, to end this video, I'm just going to show you how you would go about creating a vector field. So in our viewport, if we hold control and right click, it'll bring up this option again. And this time we're going to click create vector field. And so you can see this made this rectangular frame here. And so I selected it with control left click. And now I'm just going to make it so that it's intersecting our conductor, and I'm pressing D here just to manipulate it here, and then I'm holding T and right click dragging to center it here. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make it a little smaller, and then you're going to highlight it and bring up the object dialog by pressing enter. And so you can see we have our simulation request, which we just made, our profile, which is the hole that we were running the forward model for, the associated transmitter loop for that hole, and a channel. So if I select the primary field, you can see we now have a visual representation of our primary. You can do secondary field and you can do total field. You can also change the density of the vector field in each direction there. So you can see how that changed it. And you can, as you drag your vector field to different positions in your viewport, it will automatically update. So this is a really useful tool, both for just gaining a sense of what's going on with your fields relative to your conductor. Can also be useful for things like survey planning, for designing loops that are null coupled or max coupled to some assumed target. So yeah, and that will show up in your world tree as vector field number 1, and you can toggle it anytime you don't want to see it. So that pretty much concludes this video, where we just sort of walked through how to create a plate, promote it to a surface, and how to manipulate both plates and ribbons in Provus.